Well, howdy y'all, and welcome back to Country Fried Minis. I'm your host Cameron, the country boy in the big city, presenting once again from the Bullshit Corner 2.0, and today I'd like to talk to y'all about... the hell is it this time?
Hey, what do you think you're doing?
Well, I was about to paint this fabulous little infinity model.
You call yourself a miniature painting channel, but you haven't painted Warhammer yet?
You know, I think I did paint some Warhammers way back in the day. Something about space dudes and some elves.
You can't avoid painting glorious Games Workshop models forever. It's time for your makeover, Country Fried Minis.
Alrighty, sure, whatever you say.
Get dripped, nerd!
By golly, this is paint water!
Ugh, come on. Is that really necessary? The paint water from the Pega Paint Water Mug TM is delicious.
Well, I don't know about paint water being good, but the duds sure are snazzy, and I like this here little cup too. Thanks, Pega.
Well, I challenge you to paint this good miniature for once. And finally, you can prove that you're a real miniature painter. I'll see you later, nerd.
Well, I wouldn't exactly call a model by Mr. James' workshop to be good, but he sure does look like a happy little filler. Let's get into it. Okay, y'all, it's been 1,000,001 years since I got into a Games Workshop kit, and this one's something special. Not only did Pega Neko challenge me to a paint-up of a fine Warhammer product, but y'all had an opportunity to choose the model I'd be subjected to. After a fun little poll, the Discord community has spoken, and the Skink Starseer was the favorite by a fair margin. I myself really wanted to work on the Horticulus Slimux, but that'll just have to be for another Selling Out to Games Workshop episode, perhaps sometime in the new year. Anywho, this whole ordeal was captured on livestream while hanging out with some of our fantastic community members. Y'all ended up seeing my struggles with this kit after working on so many metal and resin models as of late. I suppose the great takeaway here is to go slowly and with careful intent, making sure to file down any sprue connections and mold lines as you go. The GW instruction books have gotten quite better than I remember them in the early aughts, so it wasn't too intimidating. That said, I was quite shocked at just how much work and how many parts could possibly go into our little Skinkus Rex. He ended up being comprised of something like 50 parts, which goes hand in hand with the price of $50 as well as the base size of 50mm. I wonder if there's some kind of term like alliteration that refers to the repetition of numbers. Well, never mind, that's nonsensical rambling thoughts. Better get my mind back to putting this little lizardy boy together utilizing a bevy of hobby supplies. This time around we got to use the clippers, the files, and our Mr. Hobby Mr. Cement S, so it was a real smorgasbord of fun hobby and elements. I personally feel that anytime you dive deep into the tool supply, you know you're in for a real treat of a project. And this one was no exception. Well, the assembly's been a bit of a complex nightmare, but it's the next step that's going to need a little bit extra. Let's take a peek. Okie day, we've had a problem and need to bust out this big ass jar of sauerkraut to deal with it. Nah, I'm just pulling your leg. This big ass jar is full of a whole lot of gray styrene sourced from old Games Workshop sprues melted into a thick goop via complete immersions and pure acetone. When melted in this fashion, the styrene is softened into a sticky, stringy paste, but not completely dissolved into solution as one would expect by using methyl ethyl ketone, also known as butanol. Digressing, we're getting out this sprue goo because I had a few tiny gaps on the stone platform that were a bit unsightly. By filling those gaps with this stuff, it'll put a little extra material in the joins that we can file down right afterwards. This stuff combined with my Mr. Hobby Mr. Cement S will cause a solid welding of the individual pieces, and everything will effectively be one solid piece of styrene in the end. Another little aside here, my Mr. Cement S is comprised of a mixture of butanone and ethyl acetate. If you'd like to know more about this stuff, Brent from Goobertown Hobbies has a fantastic sciencey video on the topic, marked with a convenient card above. Well, where was I? Oh yeah, we put the goo on and mushed it into the crevices and then removed the excess with various methods, including the tips of both the hobby blade and my fingers. This stuff really helps out in a jam like this and prevents unsightly and unwanted gaps. Make sure to save your old sprues as well if you'd like to prepare your own jar of hobby sauerkraut. Can you believe it's already time to introduce today's guest palette? Cubone! Our sticky buddy here is going to help us out first by holding on to a little bit of this here Bob Smith Industries extra thick Maxi Cure cyanoacrylate glue. Once we've got our dollop of adhesive, it's once again time to spread that goo on the feet of our model with a toothpick. Another brief aside here, big recommend on a small container of toothpicks in your own hobby corner. They're just too useful and inexpensive to not keep some around. Anyhow, once we've got the stone seat stuck in position, we'll hit it with a bit of our Bob Smith Industries Instaset, instantly setting the glue in place. To give a little bit of extra visual interest to that base, next up is going to be some little chunks of broken up scrap corkboard. If the pieces are small enough, they aren't always instantly recognizable as cork and give a fantastic little sprinkling of texture to your basing schema. Finally, we'll get out a pair of hardened steel pliers with a wire cutter on them, some paper clips, a cheap pen vise, and some small drill bits in order to mount our enthroned reptile. Setting a small pin in the underside of this stone seat will allow us to create a secure connection to a temporary painting base without marring up the connection points of the rocky duvet. Since there's a lip that seats securely into a trough on the throne proper, we want to preserve that connection point for a firm bond later, while also ensuring that the boy is removable from the base without too much effort, all while ensuring that this subassembly is firmly attached to that base for painting purposes. Thanks for your help, Cubone! With our little lizardy boy all readied up and attached to his temporary painting base, it's time to prime. Roll that beautiful spray booth footage. Ooh yeah, I love these shots of filling my airbrush cup with that Stynylrez primer. On a different note, and speaking of rolling that beautiful footage, do y'all remember those bean commercials that I just referenced with that little bit of now ancient pop culture? Anyhow, there was this whole thing on the Bush's Baked Bean ads where Jay Bush was hanging out with his dog Duke, and the dog was always trying to sell the secret family recipe of the beans with the intention to make a fortune. I'm not even really sure that the dog was actually a talking dog, or if Jay just had some crazy cranial trauma going on, or maybe he was just completely insane. On that note, I keep conflating the dog in these old popsicle lick-a-color commercials with the dog in the Bush's Baked Beans commercials because they're both named Duke. The kid asked Duke if he saw the colors, and Duke reminded the kid that he's colorblind, and the kid was completely shocked. It's that whole situation again where I'm not sure if the dog is actually talking or the guy is just completely insane. Furthermore, is the kid surprised the dog is talking back, or is he surprised that the dog is colorblind and isn't seeing the same crazy colors that he is? Same kind of boat with Jay Bush. Anyhow, Jay Bush loved three things in this world: Duke, baked beans, and beautiful bean footage. That's the reference. Don't know why it's the reference, but sometimes I just fall down these rabbit holes of experimentation and have no choice but to dive deep. What was I talking about again? Oh yeah, make sure to clean the heck out of your airbrush.
Roll that beautiful bean footage.
After filling that tiny little gap and slapping another coat of Stynylrez onto the model, it's finally time to start putting some color on it. You know, I've been fairly steady in my resistance to giving in to the siren call of Mr. James' workshop, but how bad could it be? It's not like the brand insists upon itself at every chance it gets or anything, demanding you buy more plastic to feed the beastly addiction of model collecting. There is something we can do to balance the growing pile of shame though, and that's to paint more minis, not just collect them. To get our little lizardy boy ready for his colorful day out, we're gonna work smarter, not harder. By using a combination of various Citadel contrast colors and Army Painter speed paints, we can get an extremely quick and serviceable foundation for any highlights that we want to apply going forward. Plus, slapping these translucent tones over a white base coat is so fun. It's almost like magic watching the way they work, and they make painting complex models so accessible to beginners while also providing advanced techniques to experienced painters. I definitely think any well-rounded paint kit should have a solid selection of these colored stains. I've found that several of the GW colors have been a bit on the brighter side, such as the Magos Purple and the Aethermatic Blue that we've chosen for this little guy's flesh. They're great to boost up a nice punch of color without going too dark, keeping things bright and punchy little pops of saturation while still having some solid shading. Conversely, I felt that the Army Painter speed paints are really dark and intense. It's worth mentioning that these that I'm using here are from the original line of the paints as well, not the 2.0 colors that they came out with to address the reactivation issues. These paints provide such variation in the tonal ranges all from one coat, it's positively delightful to work with them. For the most part, we're going to be treating this initial layer of the magic stain as base coat, mid-tone, and shadow color all in one. And of course, both product lines do that quite well. It was at this point that I decided to utilize the speed paint's property of dark intensity to add a little color variation to the skink. This here Hive Dweller Purple keeps a root tone with the skin while also providing some serious contrast to the light flesh. We'll be using it here for the claws and the large scales on the upper limbs. This color worked really well for both the contrast effect as well as also painting some tiny little dots suggesting even more scales beyond what's been sculpted. And finally, this application of Warp Lightning demonstrates that some of the Citadel contrast colors can be super dark as well. So it pays to get to know your colors rather than making sweeping assumptions about their performance. Now that we've got that contrast paint and speed paints all over the model, we've already got a fine looking tabletop standard model. But that's not what it's all about here on the channel. I know I say good enough is good enough, but this isn't quite good enough for me. Let's go ahead and pump this model up with a little bit of glazing action and some dry brushing. So, we want to build up some highlights here over top of the translucent base tones. And for that, we're going to do our best to preserve that transparency. This first color starts with an opaque highlight color in the form of this apple barrel bright magenta. Once properly thinned, almost to a glazed consistency already, we'll mix in a bit of the previously laid out contrast paint to darken the bright magenta down towards the Magos Purple. Although this approach will preserve the sheer colors that we've laid down already, the downside is building up our highlights will take many layers of this warm glaze. We'll dab a bit here and there, building up lighter colors on the upper facing portions of musculature as well as the sharp areas of detail such as the knuckles and the tip of the tail. We'll go through 2 rounds of layering this magenta in, adding a little more each time until we push those highlights into pink territory. Finally, a bit of Liquitex white ink will form our final highlight round. Its thin consistency helping to preserve that partially transparent glaze quality. Again, the most notable inclusions of this color are going to be on the knuckles and the tip of the tail. Their impact heightened by applying these final layers of work super sparingly. Next up, we'll take a similar approach with our Hive Dweller Purple scales. Much as we've done with the previous color, we'll use the bright magenta to build up some really thin highlights and glaze them on, ensuring that our overall palette remains pretty unified. In that both base colors are a purple brightened up with the same magenta, they indeed keep a similar warmth and feel to their individual tones. From here, we're going to use some thinned down Fire Dragon Bright to layer up the highlights on the cloak. This color is already one with pretty poor coverage and a certain thinness to it, so we just need to add enough water to the paint to get a similarly runny result to the last ones without breaking the pigment. Applying the highlights on our feller's robe is super simple, as the Fire Giant Orange Speed Paint has done a fantastic job of shading all the sculpted topography. In just a few layers, we've got this looking quite rich with some serious depth. Similarly to the last few passes on the magenta, we'll take a bit of this radioactive looking golden brand Hansa yellow and build up a glazed on gradient for all the feathers on the headdress. This takes multiple passes, but it really starts to look great after just a few. It's almost as good as wet blending or an airbrush gradient, and I think this is an approach that I'm intent to utilize more in my portfolio of painting techniques. Last but not least, my stream's chat suggested a dry brush approach to the stonework. After fumbling through a mild crisis involving 2 pots of completely dried out Mechanicus standard gray, I found that Vallejo's medium sea gray more or less fulfills that same role. Hitting the model with a fat and soft makeup brush of the stuff did some fantastic work, and after just a few passes this was looking pretty good, if a bit on the dusty end. Unfortunately, the big brush attack covered over a lot of pre-shaded details, ensuring that a fair few of them would need to be painted from scratch. Stuff like the roots and vines as well as the golden reliefs would need to be approached with a standard opaque layering process, which we'll get to later. To keep that gray nice and warm, I elected to build up the highlight layers with Ushabti bone rather than white, which would pull the stone down into a cool spectrum, and I didn't like the sound of that next to our warm and bright lizard wizard. At the end of this process, I took the edge of my 3-round liner brush and scratched some fine edge highlights right along those sharpest edges of the stone, thoroughly accentuating and finishing off the feel of the rocky textures. Once again, this simple and much beloved approach to painting stony bits shows us just how great it is, and why we indeed love the dry brush. Now that we've got the main focal points all colored up, it's time to go ahead and bring out the other little details with some traditional opaque layers. Honestly, there's something icky in my opinion about having to go back in and do stuff again, but that's exactly what we're doing now. The dry brushing efforts buried some of the work from before under unsightly layers of gray, so I'm opting to go back to some good old-fashioned opaque layering. Starting out with Mordenfang brown on these roots and vines, we've got a nice warm look to these bits. This was a fun and fairly mindless bit, just working the way around the model while hanging out with the chat in what turned out to be our 15th painting live stream. The opacity and coverage of this brown made short work of the gray bits, restoring some color back to the twisting plants. A departure from the opacity, a decision was made to use a Citadel layer paint, in this case, Tau Light Ochre. Mixing in a little bit of this thinned orangey brown highlight color allowed for a hint of the previous tone to peek through. Normally, this shade isn't my go-to when working on bark, but I was worried both about desaturating these vines as well as moving our overall tone away from warmth. In the end, the Tau Light Ochre was a great choice and I'm quite pleased with the decision. Another segue here, the Tau were my first army way back in 2001 when I first jumped into Warhammer 40k. This color harkens back to those glorious days of 3rd edition 40k and looking through that original codex at the brand new force in their fabulous vomit brown regalia. Honestly, I find it a bit disappointing that the poster color for the Tau has changed to a boring white. Gross. Anyhow, our next bit of work is going to be restoring the gold parts. I've opted to use my favorite technique of metallic work to accomplish this, and that'll be first painting it silver. Normally, I'd be shilling hard from Vallejo metal colors, but in this case I thought it might be a little too thin to have quality control of the application. For that, I've gotten back out an old friend, Army Painter Gunmetal. The coverage on this stuff is really nice, and it's a bit more controllable with fairly thick viscosity right out of the tube, allowing for some full strength application without clouding up the details. Digressing, we'll turn this silver into gold via a return to use of translucent paints, this time in the form of a nice yellowy brown coat using Citadel Snakebite leather contrast paint. One swift coat over the bright silver imparts a satisfying stain on the metal without obscuring the glint of the mica flakes too much. This technique, revealed to me in a fabulous video by CC Minis, has been a real game changer to metallics, offering a rainbow of shiny tones limited solely by what contrast colors I have on hand. Finally, we'll crown the work here and cement that it's gold with the use of some Auric Armor Gold. This color will be applied sparingly, serving as a hint more so than the overall tone. Furthermore, there's a hint of green in this paint, so that'll also help to unify the palette with the upcoming verdant parts. Yet another aside here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to admonish Citadel for the horrible quality of this paint. Sure, it looks alright, but the coverage is abysmal and the application is a nightmare. I definitely advise against using Citadel metallics when there's so many other better options out there. Bad paint, Citadel. Anyhow, we're going to keep using some Citadel paint here, this time in the form of an ultra bright layer of moot green. I wanted to evoke that these leaves are in a state of dying, heading towards a yellowy hue after being uprooted for so long. I've simply thinned this color with a bit of water, not thin enough to be a glaze, but still transparent enough to show just a hint of that underpainted foundation of warp lightning dark green. To really push up the feel of yellowing uprooted plants, I'll opt to create or highlight layers by progressively adding in phalanx yellow. Moving my love-hate tendencies towards Citadel in this positive direction, I want to point out that phalanx yellow is one of my top 10 favorite paints. It doesn't have the best coverage, a quality that I've come to expect from many Citadel paints, but the hue is so satisfying. It manages to be bright while simultaneously being a touch desaturated and trending towards the green spectrum. All this is to say, it's the perfect highlight tone for this moot green, especially in that we want the green to trend towards the yellow spectrum. As I add more of this color into the paint puddle, I'll bias it towards the edges with ever-increasing conservatism in my application, culminating in tiny little streaks that just nick the tips. In a brief departure from that last described approach, we'll abandon the yellow for a white highlight and dry brushing up the far gate, just to add a subtle bit of variation to the colors present. Moving towards the center of this ring, I do want it to get slightly cooler than the living green, evoking the barest reminder of the cold of space, almost imperceptibly. We'll go about this in 2 steps of lightning, getting a really bright and almost minty tone on the edges closest to the donut hole. A gentle reminder here to not throw old brushes away, as this ancient and well-worn painting implement here served its time well both in the past and now is a perfect small dry brush. Of course, I'm not going to let this chance escape me, so I'll work to tie it back into the established green palette by switching back to phalanx yellow to build the layers up on the little stars in the constellation. Gotta make use of that paint while it's still wet after all, and any excuse to put a bit more phalanx yellow on the model is fine by me. And finally, we're going to take care of the little horns that ring our stone donut. Instead of a warm highlight color, we'll instead cool things down and desaturate the layers into a somewhat sun-bleached bony tone with the use of Ushabti bone. Fun bit of country fried trivia here, I called this color Ushtabi bone for the first year or so of my work here on YouTube, completely unironically misreading the label. Let me know in the comments down below if you too think it would be really funny for me to continue with that trend. It'll be our little inside joke, completely missed by those who don't know the content. I could even go so far as to correct people into the correct pronunciation of this layer color, Ushtabi bone. Anyhow, this Ushabti bone is the perfect color in my opinion to layer onto bone. It's still got a bit of life in it, but it's close enough to a dirty off-white to give some rich coloration to what you're working on, all while being dark enough to highlight up even further with some white on the little tippy tips of the detail, a step that we're going to skip today in favor of keeping the horns a bit dirty and dingy. At this point we've got all the little details colored up, so it's time to start juggling them last steps: basing, washing, and assembly. With our model basically finished, I needed to juggle these steps to minimize the amount of time spent waiting on stuff to dry. It's a bit manic and all over the place, but I was working on this little feller in a live streamed session and I didn't want community members to get too bored literally watching paint dry. For that, there's a few steps here, starting with slapping some medium sea gray onto the rocks that populate our base. It dried out quickly enough and afforded a bit of haste in the next step, wherein we got back out the Gravelord Gray speed paint by Army Painter and applied it in a super thick coat all over that sea gray. It did a decent enough shading on the bits as they're rife with deep textures. Furthermore, these are basing elements, and I don't want to spend a million years layering up anything that'll pull focus from our fabulous frilled focal point. After that, a bit of time was spent carefully shading the recesses that surround our vines using some Citadel Agrax Earthshade. It both punched up the contrast in the shadows as well as bought enough time to go in and apply a thick, pasty crust of Sterling Mud Technical to the empty space on the base, filling in that flat area with some undulating and textured ground coverage. With that goop thickly applied, it was time to buy ourselves a bit more time and swap over to the final assembly of our little dude. I got out my tiny pliers and my bead buddy nippers and set out to remove our model from that temporary base as well as to remove the pin from his butt. We just need to break off the tiny little bit of super glue on the underside, intentionally applied for this very step. A quick attack with the clippers removed enough of the super glue holdfast and allowed for removal of the model, after which our pliers were employed to pull that pin out. With that bit of hobby work done, it was time to once again call upon our guest palette, Cubone. Our little friend will once again hold on to some Bob Smith Industries extra thick MaxiCure cyanoacrylate glue, allowing us an ample puddle to pull from as we set out to finalize the assembly of this little lad. Returning to that most ubiquitous and inexpensive of hobby implements, the humble toothpick, we'll grab a humongous dollop of the quick curing adhesive and more or less fill up the hollow underneath that stone throne. Lining up the rim of that rocky round with the recess on the resting spot, we'll carefully reposit the Regent in his righteous roost. From here, we're going to get out some dirty down moss to provide a bit of textural and color variation on the stone. The use of this stuff is fairly straightforward as it's water soluble and easily applies with a small brush. But it is worth mentioning that you've really got to stir this stuff up. The dirty down products come with a mixing ball in the bottle, but they tend to separate out quite a bit, and you end up with a big old puck of goopy glop in the bottom that the mixer can't quite handle breaking up. Make sure to take a little time and stir the contents thoroughly before vigorously shaking this tube until everything is completely homogeneous. If you don't mix in the entirety of the suspended constituents, the matte finish won't work, defeating the point of this product. Anyhow, and back on track, we're going to get out some little tufts of pre-made static grass clumps and give them a little dip in the remnants of that super glue, courtesy of our guest palette. Although they're self-adhesive, I don't really trust that the glue choice will last over time, so a bit of extra sticky love is required in my opinion. After applying a grip of the grass, more than I'd usually use for a model's base this time, I wanted a bit of extra detail on the dirt patches. For this, I've gotten out some of my pre-stained birch seeds in 2 tones of green. These perfect scale leaves won't do the best job of hiding the shine from any super glue, so we'll rely on a supply of white PVA glue once again held onto by our happy little Cubone guest palette. The application of these leaves is super tedious, but it's well worth it to do, as the effect that their use applies is kinda unparalleled as far as fun little base accoutrements goes. You can't really get away with just sprinkling these on, so grab your tweezers and just buckle up and enjoy the ride, layering these leaves in whichever way strikes your fancy, albeit one at a time. Finally, we're at that best part of any model project wherein it's time to black the rim and cement our work as a finished piece. A few passes around that rim with some thinned carbon black, and all that's left from here is to give y'all a grand reveal.
Wow, so you actually painted a Warhammer miniature. Say, for a Battletech painter, this is pretty good. What a little cutie lizard. I'm so glad you went with the skink. I love the little guys. The stone chair looks great with the moss effects, and that green constellation on top is very well done. You clearly didn't skimp on the basing, which is always great to see. And hey, pink and purple with the orange feathers are obviously some great colors. You know, it's kind of funny. They're actually the same colors as my merch. Buy it now at Pega Neko, creator-spring.com.
Alrighty, here at the end, I want to thank y'all for joining me today. It's been a long time since I've done a little Games Workshop model, and this little skinkus was a lot of fun to paint up. I highly recommend doing one yourself. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't throw a shout out over to Pega Neko, because I couldn't have done this without the efforts of my collaborator. Go ahead and check out her channel. I'll leave a link in the description down below. In any case, I've been Cameron on behalf of Country Fried Minis. Once again, I want to thank y'all for joining me today, and watch this space for some fun stuff coming up real soon in the future. And of course, as always, I want y'all to remember to be happy while you're painting. Take it easy, fellers. See you around next time. Little goop glop. Put it there. Because this piece does not actually line up proper when you flush it with the body.